Problem gets worse, this is the second problem, when we realize that to build an animal, a new form of animal life, we not only need new genes and proteins, but we need networks of genes that are interacting. They form a kind of a circuitry. They're called gene regulatory networks. And when scientists map out the functional relationships between genes and their gene products called proteins, they get patterns like this that look like integrated circuits. And what's going on is something like this. You have a gene that codes for building a protein, and that protein then will bind to another part of the DNA and cause another gene either to be expressed or to be suppressed, either turned on or turned off, and then the ones that are expressed will then bind someplace else and turn on another gene, and you have this beautifully choreographed system in which information that's being used to build different proteins is turned on and turned off at just the right time as cells are going through division and making new animals. So there's this brilliant choreography taking place, and the scientists who have studied these networks call them gene regulatory networks. And what they've learned about them is very interesting, is that these gene regulatory networks cannot be altered without shutting down animal development. If you change them even a little bit, you get a dead animal. And that raises a big problem, because if you want to build a new form of animal life, we now know that you need a gene regulatory network. So you've got gene regulatory network 1 that's coordinating all the expression of all the genetic information to build the animal, but you want to build a new animal, so you need to have gene regulatory network 2. But we know that gene regulatory networks don't change without destroying animal development. So you start to mutate that gene regulatory network, animal development shuts down, no more evolution. And you never get to gene regulatory network 2 and animal 2. Get the problem? And the leading scientists who have worked on this, one, Eric Davidson at Caltech, simply describes, he says this is a grave problem for neo-Darwinism, and he actually says that neo-Darwinism is a catastrophic error in thinking because it can't solve this problem. So this is just simply has been left unsolved. Now I'm going to skip over another problem that's very interesting, but it's in my book. It's about the need for very specific kinds of mutations. It turns out that if you want to get a mutation to build a new animal, it has to happen early in the development of the animal, because only those kind of mutations will cause major change, but those are the very mutations that we know also invariably kill animals in development. So it's a kind of catch-22. The kind of mutations we need, we don't get. The ones that act early and produce beneficial change, the kind we get, we don't need. Those are the minor mutations that might be heritable but don't change very much. So that's another problem. But here's an even deeper one, and this is what's called epigenetic or ontogenetic information. We all know about the information in the DNA molecule, but it turns out that's not the only information that's needed to build a form of animal life. There are other layers of information in organisms and cells that are needed to build an animal form. But according to neo-Darwinism, the information necessary to build a new animal is all contained in the DNA and the mutations that accrue in it. But if you need other levels of information, then genetic mutations alone aren't going to be sufficient. Here's a way of looking at this. DNA builds proteins, but proteins are only parts of cells, and you also have, to make an animal, you have lots of new types of cells that are needed, and new types of tissues formed of those new types of cells, and new organs formed of those new tissues and organs, tissues and the tissues and cell types. So the DNA makes the proteins. The proteins have to be organized into distinctive cell types. The cell types have to be organized into distinctive tissues. The tissues into organs, and the organs and tissues into body plans. But DNA only is responsible for the lowest level in that hierarchy, for the building of the new proteins. So where's that other information? Well, we don't know entirely. We know some of the other sources of that information, but the key point is that we know information beyond DNA is necessary, and yet neo-Darwinism says you build organisms by mutating DNA alone. We now know that's just simply not sufficient. It's not an adequate explanation. So, in other words, if body plan building new animals requires information beyond DNA, then you could mutate DNA indefinitely, not worry about the odds, and you'd still, in the best of cases, only build information for making proteins, not whole animals. So you got another really deep and profound problem. Now, all of these problems have kind of added up, and they're sifting through the literature. And so what's happening, quite contrary to what you hear when you read or listen to Bill Nye the Science Guy, or you read an article in the New York Times, or you hear the media, or you take a biology class in a mainstream university, scientists are no longer satisfied with the Darwinian explanation for the origin of major forms of life. Evolutionary scientists are no longer satisfied. And one way you know that is that they are formulating and positing new theories and new mechanisms, hoping to complement the mechanism of mutation and natural selection. And in my book, Darwin's Doubt, I look at these new proposals. And many of them are really interesting, and they add to our knowledge, our biological knowledge, and they provide some insights that are not present in a neo-Darwinian framework. But they too, it turns out, are insufficient to explain this fundamental mystery of the origin of information. There's many of these new theories. Let me illustrate with one. There's a brilliant new theory called natural genetic engineering. And it's based on the observation that many of the mutations that occur in living organisms are not random at all. They seem to be under a kind of pre-programmed adaptive capacity. So if an organism gets an environmental stress of some kind, it activates it causes the organism or the cells to turn on the production of certain kinds of proteins to help that organism respond to that environmental stress. So this pre-programmed adaptive capacity it's one of the scientists, James Shapiro, who's most well known for this theory, says it's under algorithmic control. It's fascinating, the description he has of these non-random evolutionary mechanisms, non-random mutational processes. But even Professor Shapiro doesn't explain where the pre-programming comes from. And so he gives a really interesting, enriching look at how biology actually works. It's non-Darwinian, but the fundamental question of the origin of the information is still left unsolved in his new theory. And I've shown in my book that each of these new theories is subject to that same problem. And so many of us who have been thinking about these issues in biology have been thinking, well, maybe we're looking for the wrong kind of answer as we look for an evolutionary, materialistic explanation for the origin of information. Maybe there's this pre-programming actually suggests a programmer. And this is the idea we call the theory of intelligent design, or just intelligent design. And I first encountered it in the mid-1980s, here in Dallas, in fact, at a conference that was held in Dallas in 1985. And I met at that conference a scientist named Charles Thaxton, who had just written a book called The Mystery of Life's Origins. He wasn't concerned about the origin of new forms of life from pre-existing forms, that's biological evolution. He was concerned about an even deeper question, sometimes called the theory of chemical evolution. That's how do you get the first life from the simple chemicals in the so-called prebiotic soup? And those theories of evolution were also being confronted with an information problem. You can't build even a single cell without the DNA and the information in DNA necessary to build the proteins to keep the cell alive. And so Professor Thaxton was suggesting, well, maybe what we're looking at with this problem of the origin of information isn't evidence of an undirected chemical or biological process. Maybe it's evidence of a mind, of an intelligence. Because intuitively, we think information is a mind product. It's something that we know from experience always comes from an intelligent agent, or what he called an intelligent cause. Well, I was in my last year in Dallas when I first met Dr. Thaxton, and we spent a lot of time talking about these ideas, and a year later I went off to Cambridge to do my graduate work, and I ended up deciding to do a thesis on the origin of life problem. And I left